Work today is changing faster than ever. One of the companies behind that transformation, Slack. I'm joined today by Slack CEO and TIME100 honoree, Stewart Butterfield. Stewart, this is a conversation about the future of work, but I want to first start by looking at the recent past. Let's go back a few weeks and look at what happened in March. Slack, like lots of companies, was scrambling to operate while the coronavirus lockdown was shutting down its offices. At the exact same time, Slack saw record usage rates. Take us back and explain what that week felt like.
It's funny. We have a board meeting coming up this Friday, and I realized that the last meeting we had in an office was Thursday, March 6th. I could be slightly off on the date, but it was definitely a Thursday. And after the board meeting ended, we got informed by one of our employees that the CDC had contacted them and said that they were potentially exposed. Now, thankfully, they weren't infected in the end, but because of that, we decided to shut down our office for the day and do a deep cleaning over the weekend. But in the 72 hours between that decision and Monday, everything changed. We decided that we were going to close offices and everyone was going to work from home. So it's just really incredible how fast that happened. In the couple of weeks that followed that, huge rush of adrenaline inside the company. Obviously, there's a lot of anxiety for employees and for customers and for everyone, both about the health impact and the economic impact. But meanwhile, we were facing this real increase in usage. I think the positive part of it was in those moments of crisis, I think humans have a really strong instinct to try to be of help. They want to be of service. And there was an opportunity for our employees to actually pitch in there. There was record numbers of people writing in with questions. We started doing one-on-one consultations with anyone who wanted it. And I think that gave us really something to do that took our minds off of the anxiety and allowed us to better serve our customers.
How does it feel when the fate of the world and the fate of your company seem to be moving in opposite directions?
It's really interesting. I was born in 1973, so that was stagflation. My father was a real estate developer, and so in 1982, when interest rates went to 18%, like every other real estate developer in the world, he went bankrupt. I graduated from high school into a pretty bad recession in the early 90s. I worked at dot-com crash. I personally held shares in Lehman Brothers over the weekend that they went bankrupt. And I've been through a number of these cycles. The severity and the asymmetry of the economic impact is really interesting here. So, obviously a lot of businesses felt it upfront, travel, hospitality. Some businesses, I guess, like ours, actually saw an increase in customer activity and in sales. And then a lot that were kind of neutral. And I don't think we see the true impact show up until it trickles down. So while we're 100% occupied with, serving customers, improving the product, and all the things that we should be doing to operate the business, there's a lot of uncertainty. And human beings hate uncertainty. But both customers, investors, employees, I'm no different. So really trying to hold on to the things that we are certain about and to try to make decisions as quickly as we can when we have the available information. It's kind of a different mode of working and a different way of operating.
What are your customers telling you today about the state of the economy? Can you share a little bit about their view and what that tells you about the future?
Well, we have 122,000 customers, so and they're all around the world. Some of them, as small businesses, have either gone bankrupt or at least kind of shut down for the time being. We've seen, on the one hand, enterprise customers who are proceeding much more aggressively and making decisions much more quickly to adopt the platform, and on the other side, people who are trying to defer some decision making, starting to see some kind of lockdowns on budgets and spending. And then for the vast majority, who are obviously small and medium businesses, this is starting to see like a less expansion, or the expansion that we would have normally anticipated happening across all customer cohorts doesn't show up in the same way. So the signal seems like where there aren't layoffs, there are hiring freezes. Customers are not growing as quickly. And when our customers feel pain, we also feel that same pain.
Have you considered, perhaps when the lockdown ends, keeping your offices permanently closed?
I don't think permanently closed, but definitely a real shift in how we work and the number of employees who would be remote and the degree of flexibility for those employees who live in a city where we have an office about how much they come in. And I think that's good, and I think it presents a lot of opportunities. But I also almost feel like we don't have a choice because we exist in a market for talent, and so many of our peers have already announced that they're going to allow people to work remotely, that they're going to have some flexibility. So maybe you come into the office for sequential days, but then don't come back for 2 weeks. Maybe you come into the office once or twice a week, but work from home other times. And you can imagine, like, if every one of the people with whom we compete for talent has said that, and we instead say, well, at Slack, we're going to insist and require you to come into the office. First of all, we would not be, we would limit ourselves to a much smaller pool of candidates. Even those candidates in the cities where we do have offices, so Vancouver, New York, and Toronto, and Denver, and the Bay Area, London, Dublin, Tokyo, and Osaka, those people who want the optionality or have made the decision they would like to move in the future, because a lot of people have decided I want to be near family, or I want to, I'm sick of living in an apartment. We would lose out on those. And finally, for existing employees, there's plenty of Slack employees who are in that same position. We would risk losing them. So there's an interesting kind of game theory here. Again, I support this decision, and I think it'll be long-term beneficial to the company, but there is a sense in which we don't have a choice.
You've said in the past that Slack is made for this moment. Is this because of what you see as the future of a more kind of hybrid working model?
It's less. I mean, Slack is not designed for remote work specifically, although I think it's really helpful. But the transition itself, the kind of disruption, the kind of dislocating effect of working in one way and then suddenly working in another, is actually the thing that Slack is made for. So in our S1, the document we file with the SEC on the path to going public, we said something like, in a world with an increased pace of technological change that drives change in consumer behavior, which drives change in markets, and globalization that leads to a lot more dynamic economic environment, the challenge, I guess, that is common to all organizations is the ability to achieve some kind of agility, or that starts with alignment. And if you're able to create that alignment over time in a dynamic environment, then you can be agile enough to be successful. And that's what we think we offer. So that's not out of the box. You don't start using Slack and suddenly you're more agile, but it's the most effective tool or instrument for both employees and for leaders to create that kind of agility. So when I said made for this moment, part of that was, the customer orientation of the company and our ability to really step up and be helpful. And part of it was, this is, the most disruptive period in the history of American business, probably.
The most disruptive.
Yeah, or certainly it's hard to rank them, but certainly it's close. And I think a lot of people are discovering the advantages of taking all the conversations that were happening across the organization, but in inboxes where they're kind of partial and fragmented and not organized in any real way, and moving those into channels. You create a channel for everything that's happening across the company, and then suddenly everyone knows where to go to ask their question. Everyone knows where to go to give their update. Everyone knows where to go to get caught up in something. And that has a huge impact when you're working in the office, and obviously, of course, when you're working remotely. So we had 100,000 plus customers before any of this happened, and they all got value when they were mostly working in the office. And we expect that people, to the extent that they go back completely or kind of partially, the benefits will still be there. But let me put it this way, I guess, there's a lot of industries that were disrupted. Media is probably the most extreme example, retail, but just the technological changes have had such a huge impact. They've been relatively localized to like the industry where the technology had this impact. Now everyone's experiencing this all at once. Like JP Morgan, 280,000 employees, suddenly they're not going to offices anymore. And logistics, shipping, wholesale, retail, healthcare, financial services, just like everything what goes through this really tumultuous change. The positive thing, I guess, to take away is with every challenge, there's an opportunity. And for Slack as a company, not the product or the business, we're really trying to take this as an opportunity to reinvent and reimagine how we manage, how we operate, how we report on the business, how we make decisions, how those decisions are communicated. Because I think a lot of that is just, it's evolved over the course of decades. It's kind of, there's a standard way of doing things that isn't really ever examined. And having the option or the time or the position to really examine those and imagine how we can do things better is exciting.
Inside that opportunity is a real change for, among other things, work-life balance. I came to visit you in 2015 just as Slack was a year into its business, and this company that was supposed to be out there, as many people said, killing email. And I'm curious what you think about what has changed. When we talked then, we talked about how unhealthy our relationship was to technology. I'm afraid our relationship to technology has only gotten worse in the last 5 years. Do you fear at all that Slack adds to that problem?
No, I don't. So no, I don't fear that Slack adds to the problem. I think it's a more general reaction, and I think the context that you're thinking of is this has been true since the dawn of time, like the domestication of animals and the development of agriculture and everything. But you think back to the Industrial Revolution, we suddenly had this productive capacity that we didn't have before, and it reshaped cities. It reshaped the economy and the labor market. And in the early stages, often really to the worse, right? There was a time when the Charles River and the Thames in London, they would catch on fire all the time because the pollution was so extreme. And every wave of technology both has some real negative impact along with a positive impact, especially until we're able to, as a society or as a species, figure out how to take advantage of it without the downsides. But it also is it's different, and kind of by definition, because people don't like change, because people don't like uncertainty, there's a negative reaction. So it's not to say that it's not warranted, because I think it is in some respects warranted. But you can go back to Plato complaining about written language, saying this is going to destroy people's memories. Why would anyone remember anything if they can write it down? You saw similar reactions in the 19th century to newspapers, to radio, to television, to computers, to the internet, smartphones. They're all kind of analogous conversations. And I think the benefits of those technologies largely have been enormously positive on net. It just takes us some time to figure out how to realize those advantages without the downsides.
You're describing a number of different waves in history, and perhaps we're at another moment where there's an acceleration happening, particularly what people call a new digital transformation. That's been very meaningful to your space, to the business enterprise computing space, and there's been a lot of change in the last few months, and in that space. One company that comes to mind is Zoom. Are you jealous of what Zoom's been able to accomplish over the last few months?
The business results are fantastic. I'm very close to Eric Yuan, the CEO. In fact, I was talking to him earlier this morning and yesterday. Net overall, hugely positive impact on the business. Consumers it's very different than enterprise, let's say. Eric Zoom sells to a large company that has a big internal IT department, and end users inside that company have a problem. They go to IT. They don't go to Zoom. A solo, accountant works all by themselves, decides to start using Zoom with their clients, and they have a problem with their webcam. Who do they ask? They go to Zoom. But the actual consumer behavior is totally different. And having worked in consumer internet before, obviously Flickr and Yahoo more broadly after that, I'm trying to think of a nice way to say this, but you get the really disgusting side of human beings when you have that kind of consumer scale, that independent actors, all the spam and the scamming and the phishing and the porn and a lot of tools and analysis that you need in that environment that aren't required in the enterprise business. So I think it presents some new challenges as well. And I think Zoom has been extremely capable in overcoming those, but it's an enormous amount of work and it's an enormous distraction. And I think ultimately you have a vision of what you're trying to accomplish for the product, but just for the business. I'm sure that they have a real roadmap. It's not just what you see today. It's what they're planning for the next 3 years, the next 5 years, the next 10 years. And I'm sure that they never anticipated, birthday parties and happy hours and things like that operating on the same platform. So I'm not jealous of that part of the headaches that come along with it.
Okay, not jealous of Zoom. I want to talk about another player in the space. I think we have to talk about Microsoft. You've said in the past, Microsoft is trying to kill us. Microsoft is something like 100 times the size of Slack as a company. How scared are you of Microsoft?
Not scared. Obviously it's a concern. And I think in the early days, like let's say like 3-4 years ago, there's a lot of internal conversations of Microsoft did X, so what should we do as a result? And I think it's hard for people to wrap their heads around this, but we should be competitor aware, but customer obsessed. And if we thought that something was a good idea 6 months ago, and now Microsoft does something, should we change what we had planned? We shouldn't, right? Because what would we give up of customer value in order to compete? We should always be doing the thing that customers would want us to be doing. Especially like an ideal, knowledgeable, super rational customer. They'll tell us what they want, and they don't want us wasting energy and time on competition. So you look at this picture of Microsoft in 1977. I don't know if you've ever seen it, when they're still in Albuquerque. It's kind of hippies, and Paul Allen and Bill Gates have long hair. And you think about IBM at the time, the biggest, most valuable, most powerful company in the world, and how Microsoft just snuck past them. But later, how at a time when Microsoft controlled everyone's operating system, controlled all the web browsers in the world, had a huge lead in online services. They bought Hotmail and they had MSN, starting to compete with Google in like 2001, 2002, 2003, and spent tens of billions of dollars over the next couple of decades, and were never able to do it, even though they were, they had literally every advantage that you could possibly have. And then I'll keep this short, and you can keep going. But 2007, Google pivoting so hard when they realized that Facebook was getting all this traction, and forcing YouTube commenters to use Google Plus for the first time, and maybe the only time ever, promoting something on their homepage that wasn't the actual search results, leveraging Gmail to get Google Plus usage, and it really made no difference to Facebook. So the lesson we take from that is the small, focused startup that has real traction with customers often has an advantage against the large incumbent that has multiple lines of business.
To follow that metaphor or analogy, you believe that you'll be able to sneak past Microsoft?
Yeah. I mean, we have, right? We have 122,000 customers. We just signed Amazon, who I think is the second largest employer. If you look at the top 10 American companies, the majority of them are using Slack. The federal government, but also the governments in Norway and Sweden and the UK and Australia, Canada. Slack has a lot of success in healthcare, in financial services, in retail, enormous enterprises. So, that's what has happened looking backwards. And when we look forwards and you think about the next 3 to 5 years, I think the opportunity is enormous. And there's plenty of room for Microsoft as well. I mean, obviously they're a hugely successful company. The trick, I'm not sure if it's a trick or what, but I guess the thing to keep in mind is, if you go back to 1970-ish, like kind of the first wave of real IT inside of companies, from that point to now, from like 1979 when VisiCalc, the first spreadsheet, was released till today, every year companies have spent more money per employee per year on software. Every year, employees have spent more minutes of their day using software. Every year, there's been a larger number of tools in use at a given company. Every year, there's been more software companies in existence, and more software companies that have, more than $10 million in revenue, more than $100 million in revenue, more than $1 billion in revenue. All of those, none of those things stopped this year, right? Those are multi-decade long secular trends that will continue for decades to come. And as that happens, I think there's two things. One is the opportunity, the economic opportunity is enormous. But the other thing that's, I think, really interesting is we tend to automate the things, and this is almost tautological, but you automate the things that are most amenable to automation. right? The things that are simplest to automate. And you automate those things where the gap between the performance of the computer and the performance of the human is greatest. So relative to computers, we're terrible at doing arithmetic. Relative to computers, we're terrible at remembering things. So like those are a lot of the first applications of computing technology. Typically, what is going to be automatable is the tasks that are most repetitive, kind of most mind-numbing, in some sense the simplest. And that means that the work that remains for people is actually more demanding of human intelligence and creativity than before. So I think that means it's both harder to perform, but also much harder to manage. I think the challenges that organizations face are kind of compounding in a way that doesn't show up when you're kind of experiencing it day to day, or even looking at the businesses quarter by quarter. But over the course of years, and especially over the course of decades, I think will be really transformative.
Stewart, you tend to take a sort of long historical view. I want to pull back from this moment in history and get your perspective on it. You and your partner, Jennifer Rubio, gave a significant donation to Black Lives Matter and to other social justice causes. What role does a CEO like you and a company like Slack play in terms of advancing equality today?
So first of all, obviously, I have enormous power within Slack, right? So don't have that same power at the national level or the global level. But I think it's really important. I mean, obviously, for inside the company, I think there's an increased awareness that maybe CEOs want to remain apolitical, but you can differ on what counts as a political problem. So I think what we saw, not just with the murder of George Floyd, I mean, that's obviously one thing, but in the weeks that followed, the violence on the side of police towards protesters who were protesting peacefully, towards the media, I think it was really shocking and eye-opening. And I mean, you could argue about this, but I don't feel like that's a political issue where there's, one side is the police should beat people with clubs, and that's a reasonable position. And then another position is police shouldn't beat people with clubs, or one position is Black people should be murdered by police regularly. And the other position is that they shouldn't. That's just, it's unacceptable. And I think that the shift that you saw that I believe is really important and will have real impact over the course of history is what counts as acceptable conversation. Like literally, this isn't the most profound example, but one of the things that I've been most kind of heartened by, I guess, in a way, is different brands' Twitter accounts smacking down customers who are responding to their Black Lives Matter statement with "No, they don't," or "All Lives Matter," or something like that. There was one moment where Hulu had posted something in Facebook, just a general statement of solidarity and Black Lives Matter and stuff like that. And one of a customer, or who knows, someone responded saying, well, now you've lost me as a customer and I've talked to 50 of my friends and we're all going to cancel our subscriptions. And the response from Hulu was, thanks for the update from the Klan meeting. That's not something that I feel like they would have said 3 months ago or a year ago. And what's important about it, I think, is it sets the boundaries of what's acceptable behavior, and it kind of demands something. And if you have a belief that you believe to be common with everyone else, you feel much more supported in that, and you feel much more certain in that belief. If you suddenly realize that no one agrees with you, maybe a natural reaction is to be defensive and dig in, but long term, I think you start to realize if everyone else believes something, that's the opposite of what I believe, maybe I'm wrong, and that's required, and most real progress that we've seen historically has come from a real shift in those boundaries and in what's acceptable. Especially in the US today, with the kind of relative weakness at the federal level, it's important that people who are in positions of power and economic power is one of those dimensions, exercise that power to try to create the social good. I mean, so justice is an enormous component of that. But left to their own devices, I don't think people are bad at all. but we're certainly disorganized, and progress doesn't tend to spontaneously happen. It requires like this input of will. It's not coming from where we have historically expected it to come from. And so I think business leaders, the media, I think religious leaders, people who are in positions of power just broadly have, it's incumbent upon them to try to create social change.
If you could give Silicon Valley a grade on advancing equality, what would that grade be?
I think it's actually better than some of its biggest critics. Because here's what I think we don't always take account. I believe racism is systemic. It doesn't mean that someone designed it and planned everything out, but I do mean that there's a bunch of forces that reinforce each other. No one has a magic force field around their office or their corporate culture. So if Slack exists in a racist society, then there's racism in Slack as well. And when you say that, I think it can be quite shocking to people, because when they hear racism, they think like a burning cross, or something just outrageous, like using the N-word or something like that. When that's not, obviously that is an extreme expression of racism, but that's not the totality of it. So I don't think that tech companies are free of racism at all. I also don't think that they're, let me put it this way. I think the net impact is good for all but the lowest kind of quartile or lowest decile. And there's more awareness, and technology companies, I think, are quicker to act. And whether that action is motivated by like fear of embarrassment or, true and noble feelings of what people want to accomplish, doesn't really matter as long as the action actually shows up. So, it's trite to say made some progress, a long way to go, blah, 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 blah. But I think that it's useful to have some carrot along with a stick, not to make people feel better and not to assuage people, but to really make it clear what you want to happen. Requires some direction and some encouragement. And when you see something that you don't want to happen, it's right. It's fine to criticize it. But I think the blanket statements condemning the technology industry or really any other industry don't have the positive impact that I think those people hope. I think it does motivate people who are fearful of being embarrassed. So maybe at the margins it does, but you really need both.
Well, I think that's a great place to leave it. Slack's Stewart Butterfield, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much. Great conversation.